Well, here we are again. I hope you enjoyed this lesson this week. Actually, I was terribly frustrated because I knew I was going to be sharing with all of you. And when I looked at how much information was here, I thought, Lord, where do I land on this whole thing? It just seemed an impossibility this week. I would like to spend a whole week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks on each segment. So hopefully you have done your homework and done all the work that I would have done or could have done or should have done. Warren Wiersbe wrote, and he said, and I think he was quoting someone else's statistics, but he said it's been said that man can live about 40 days without food, about 3 days without water, and about 8 minutes without air, but only 1 second without hope. And even though we look at these 3 miracles we're looking at today, they seem like diverse from one another, yet they all have a common thread that's running through each one of them. Hold on until I get myself organized up here. I like to be organized in all that I do. Okay. There are some common threads. There are 2 common threads that I see running through each of these stories. And we're not going to get to the segment about the parables because hopefully that you will have done that. And to tell you the truth, I don't understand them anyway, so it would be impossible for me to share about those. But the common thread, number 1, was that they were all helpless. And those of you who stood and raised your hand, you are feeling helpless in your circumstances today. It seems like the waves are crashing over your head. Second of all, the common thread that was running through was that they were all bereft of human resources. There was no one who could help them. One came with the hope of resurrection. One came with the hope of restoration. And the disciples came with the hope of rescue. Now, 2 of these stories talk to us of faith, and 1 story was nothing but fear. But all of those that were involved had an encounter with Jesus that changed their lives forever. The first 2 stories tell us of a miracle within a miracle. It was like a giant sub-sandwich. Now, how many of you love football? How many of you actually understand football? How many of you know that the biggest holiday in the United States, number 3 on the list, is the Super Bowl Sunday? But let me tell you, it's really not about the football. It's all about the food. And you're probably already planning that special thing that you're going to prepare or what is tradition for you on that day. Now, I know that when you cook something for this, that most of you, or many of you, your husbands probably like sub sandwiches. So what do you have? You have meat, you have cheese, you have lettuce, you have pepperoncinis, you have maybe some onions there, some pickles there, some cheese, whatever you can find, and then it's placed in between 2 great big pieces of bread. It's awesome. Doesn't it make you hungry? Let's go next door and have lunch. Then I won't have to teach. But that would be like these stories, because one is within the other. And the first one talks to us about resurrection. Jesus was by the Sea of Galilee in the region of Capernaum. Remember, that was kind of his headquarters. And great multitudes of people were following him, and those who came were coming with wants rather than giving. They came to take from Jesus rather than to give back to anyone. And Jesus was speaking in a house with tax collectors, with sinners, with Pharisees, and with disciples. And suddenly, as he was teaching, a ruler from the synagogue, who was Jairus, ran into his presence, interrupting him and worshiping. Now, I noticed that when we worship here on Thursday mornings, we're very mild and very quiet. When this ruler came to the house of Jairus, Jairus came to the house where Jesus was, I don't think that he was mild and quiet. He was crying out with everything within him that Jesus would come and help him. And we need to worship, and that's exactly what he did. He fell at the feet of Jesus and he began to worship him. That means that he was reverencing Jesus as a person. Now, Jesus didn't turn and rebuke him for the interruption because he was teaching, but he responded to the plea to simply touch his daughter who had died. Now, some of the Gospels contradict each other, seemingly. One says she died, one said she was on the point of death. So however that would happen, when each one wrote the Gospels, they saw it from a different point of view. She could have been dead according to one Gospel, and she could have been just on the point of death according to the other one. But imagine how this father must have felt, how fearful he was, how anguished he was, how his heart must have been breaking, how his love and devotion was just for this daughter. He wanted her to be touched. He wanted her to be healed. He wanted to be raised from the dead, if that was a possibility. He felt every single emotion that you and I would feel as a parent. Have you ever labored over a child that was sick, and there just didn't seem to be anything that you could do, and you were filled with fear and trepidation and all of those things? This is how this man felt. And don't forget, when we read these stories, these are real people. They had real emotions and real needs, just like you and I have. Now, some believe that he could have been one of the elders that the centurion sent to Jesus for his miracle. And seeing the miracle that the centurion experienced in the healing of a servant that we saw last week, he could have seen Jesus' compassion and the power, and this could have given him the faith to believe for his own child in such extreme circumstances. However, there were no human resources left for his daughter. She was dead. Now, it's interesting to me because Jairus' daughter was just 12 years old. She was a young girl who was entering into womanhood. But also the woman with the issue of blood had had it for 12 years. Did you catch all of that when you went through it? I thought that was very interesting because one was just being born when the other one was beginning her illness. But Jesus' only response to Jairus was to rise and go with him. But then another crisis intervened. Remember the second miracle within a miracle. And this was a miracle of restoration. The crisis of Jairus was urgent, but just as he had interrupted Jesus, his situation was interrupted by a woman who pressed through the crowds to touch the hem of Jesus' garments. This was not a woman who was seeking resurrection. She just needed restoration. And she came suddenly out of the crowd with the hope of her healing. She had suffered from an issue of blood for 12 long years. She had spent all she had on the doctors. She had suffered from their various experiments on her, and who knows how archaic and medieval those practices must have been in those days. I know they put leeches on people. They did all kinds of things, but she was not getting better. In fact, she was getting worse. Perhaps she had a hormonal imbalance from which the endometrium is excessively thick, or uterine polyps, or fibroid tumors. Have any of you ever had that? Painful menstrual cycles. Her illness for 12 long years would have caused her to have anemia. She would have extreme pain. She would have discomfort, and she would have an inability to enjoy a normal life. Not only that, just think of what it would take to stop the flow of blood, to take care of it. We have a lot of things that are available to us as women, but she did not have these things available to her. And on top of the physical disabilities, she also was considered a social outcast. She was considered unclean. She was not allowed to go into the court of the temple or into the synagogue. No one could touch her, or they would be considered unclean as well. No one could sit or touch what she had sat on or touched, or they would be unclean. If she had a husband, she could not have had relations with him because she would have been unclean, and he would have been considered unclean as well. And to go through the ceremonial ritual cleansing was a long process. Now, I want you to turn to Leviticus because chapter 15 gives us the specific regulations concerning women who had issues of blood, whether it was the normal menstrual cycle or prolonged illness in a woman. It's important for us to get a grasp on what she was going through. Verse 19 in chapter 15 says, if a woman has a discharge, and the discharge from her body is blood, she shall be set apart for 7 days. And whoever touches her shall be unclean until evening. So that meant that whoever touched her couldn't go into the court for worship of the tabernacle. They could not go into the synagogue. So if it was a man, he would be considered unclean. And everything that she lies on during her impurity shall be unclean. Also everything that she sits on shall be unclean. Whoever touches her bed shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean till evening. And whoever touches anything that she sat on shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. If anything on her bed or on anything on which she sits, when he touches it, he shall be unclean until evening. And if any man lies with her at all, so that her impurity is on him, he shall be unclean for 7 days, and every bed on which he lies shall be unclean. So no man would want to do that. If a woman has a discharge of blood for many days, other than at the time of her customary impurity, like this woman, or if it runs beyond her usual time of impurity, all the days of her unclean discharge shall be as the days of her customary impurity. She shall be unclean. Every bed on which she lies all the days of her discharge shall be to her as the bed of her impurity, and whatever she sits on shall be unclean as the uncleanness of her impurity. Whoever touches those things shall be unclean. He'll wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. And if she's cleansed of her discharge, she'll count for herself 7 days, and after that she'll be clean. And on the 8th day she'll take for herself 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons and bring them to the priest to the door of the tabernacle of meeting. And so then the priest has to make sacrifice for her. So it was not an easy thing for her. This made her a social outcast, lonely and alone, mentally, physically, and financially depleted. I remember the time that we went to Thailand, and we were told very specifically when we got there that we were not in the marketplace or out in public to ever brush up or touch one of the Buddhist monks in the saffron robes. Now, I don't think that that regulation was for the men, but it was certainly for the women. And if we were to touch them, they would fly into an absolute rage, just totally come unglued, because they would be considered unclean because they'd been touched by a woman. And through that, because of that, they would have to go through a long ceremonial cleansing process. So this woman was going through all of these things. She must have felt embarrassed, unwanted, unworthy, because her illness was not even something that someone talked about. Now, it's not the same today, but when I was a little girl and I was being raised, my mother taught me that when I started my cycles at the age of 11, that I was not to talk about it in public. I was not to talk about it at all with anyone, just with her. So it was something that we kind of kept covered up. Now, today it's very open. I mean, we have advertisements on TV for all those things, so it's just not the same. But you can imagine what she was going through, and her one hope was simply to touch the hem or the border of Christ's garment, the tassels or fringes which every Israelite had to wear as the Pentateuch required. You know, as I thought about her, I thought that there could have been a stench about her as well from all that she was going through. Yet, even in her state of weakness, because of the anemia that she would experience and the pain that she would be going through, she had enough strength to press through the crowd to get to Jesus. The language that's used when it says the crowds were pressing in and she pressed through them literally mean that it was so difficult because of the crowd that was around Jesus that it was even difficult for him to breathe. He was almost to the point of suffocation. And yet, here is this woman, weak as she was, who pressed through the crowd with all that she had within her because her one hope was to touch just the hem of his garment. Perhaps because of her uncleanness, this is why she only wanted to touch his robe. Maybe she thought that he would turn and become angry and outraged if she were to touch him, because he would then be unclean as well. And it took great fortitude for her and great perseverance, but she was distressed, she was desperate, and she was a determined woman. I wonder if she pressed through the crowd and everybody around her knew who she was and they backed away. Unclean, unclean. Here comes an unclean woman. Don't even get near her. I just wonder if all those things were going on. But she had enough hope to be willing to risk the consequences of possible rebuke or anger from the Lord. But her hope was rewarded by a miracle. She had placed her hope superstitiously in his garment, but power was really in the person of Jesus Christ. Now, several years ago, before most of you were even born, there was a man named Oral Roberts. There's a university now in Oklahoma. And Oral Roberts, everybody listened to him on the radio. He was pretty famous, and he was known as a healer. And amazingly enough, when people listened to him and he prayed for them, they got healed. You know, God will use anything. But he used to be on the radio before we had television, and he would say to people, you need just a point of contact. Just lay your hand on the radio and God will touch you. And amazingly, those miracles did happen. People exercised their faith in what God could do by laying their hands on the point of contact. I wonder if that's why we have the laying on of hands, because there's a point of contact that we have that says, I am reaching out to the Lord here in seriousness. And Jesus then, as she touched him, knew that power had gone out from him. That word power is dunamis. What is the same word that we get from our English from those words? Dynamite, dynamic. Those things had gone out from Jesus, and he knew that that woman had touched him. But he asked the question, who touched me? Did you wonder about that? Did you question? Why did he ask? Who touched me? He was Jesus. He knew. He was God. He knew. He was omniscient. He knew everything. I believe that he wanted to draw her out from the crowd, out of the shadows, and into the light, because it gave her confirmation of her healing, and then it gave him the comfort of his concern, because he was able to say, go in peace. Those words literally mean, in peace, go. And he was giving her not only healing, but he was giving her peace, because not only had her body been ill, but because of her illness, she had been in mental torment, and he was giving her peace. Her healing was free. It was unlike the others who had taken her money and left her ill. Everyone else had taken from her, but Jesus gave to her. Isn't that what he does for us? People will take. The world will take. The enemy wants to take. But only Jesus gives back to us. Our cure from our sin and our shame is a free gift from Jesus, but it cost him everything. Her cure was immediate, just like our cure from sin is immediate when we confess it and turn to him. And because of her faith, because of her hope in him, she witnessed an even greater healing, the healing of her heart and her mind and her spirit, as he said, go in peace. Now she was healed, but Jairus must have been terribly frustrated and fearful by then. Can you imagine what was going on in his mind? He was watching Jesus minister to this woman. He was saying, listen, my problem is much more urgent than hers. I've got a dead daughter. What are you doing? Why don't you save her till later and come back and take care of her? Wouldn't you have felt that way? My problem is much more urgent. Why are you stopping to minister to her? I would have rushed forward and just pushed this woman out of the way and said, death is far more important than what your problem is. But in the midst of this, Jairus got the final word. She was dead. He didn't need restoration. He needed resurrection. He did not, however, look at the circumstances, but he simply looked at the only one who could help. What are you going through today? Are you looking at the circumstances of your problems, of your great need, of your desperation? Or are you turning your eyes on the only one who can help you, which is Jesus? It's so easy, isn't it, to get caught up in the circumstances of our lives. But then we have our focus off the Lord. Now the Pharisees at this time, about this period of time, were beginning to question Jesus' authority. But Jairus knew that even the Pharisees and the scribes couldn't help him. Now he was a ruler of the synagogue. So it took a lot of courage for him to come and say, I need help. Please, I'm desperate. Will you heal? Will you touch? Will you raise my daughter? Because he knew that the others around him, his peers, could have been on his case as well. But like the woman, he looked at Jesus. And his faith was rewarded by the resurrection of his precious daughter. Being raised from the dead is a great miracle, but being raised from spiritual death is even greater, because those who were raised from the dead had to die sometime. Jairus was an intercessor for his daughter, and we're called to be intercessors for those around us who are literally the walking dead. Did you know that? Those that you see and that you've got living in your neighborhoods that are next door to you or that are in the market, those who do not know Jesus Christ are the walking dead. And we can be intercessors for them. Just like Jairus interceded for his daughter. In desperation, he went to Jesus and said, save her. We can go to Jesus on a daily, moment-by-moment basis sometimes and intercede for those who are lost around us. The day is coming when we will hear the word that this little girl heard. Arise, arise. We will all hear that word, and some will be raised to eternal separation, and some, all of us, to eternal joy. Now, these two miracles tell of resurrection and restoration, but the next miracle speaks of a rescue. It was the evening of the day when Jesus had just taught the 7 parables recorded in Matthew 13. Can you imagine how exhausted he must have been? Someone did a study some years ago, and they said that 30 minutes of teaching is the equivalent of 3 hours of digging ditches. If you don't believe it, you stand up here and try it for 30 minutes. Jesus was weary, he was worn, he was exhausted from the constant demands of the multitude who always wanted something from him, wanted his attention, his touch, his power. So no one can question his desire for rest and for a few hours away to pray and to ponder and to recuperate, to have time alone without any demands. Those of you who have preschoolers, toddlers, infants, you know what it is to always have somebody tugging on your pants. Always asking, Mom, Mom. Waking you up in the middle of the night with a cry, Mom, I've wet my bed again. You just want to tell them to go back to bed and you'll take care of it in the morning. Those times when you feel like you can't go another moment. You just want time alone. When my kids were little and my husband would ask me, what would you like for Mother's Day? My response was always the same. I want you to take the kids away for the day and let me have my quiet time all to myself. It was glorious. It didn't happen very often because he couldn't take it for a whole day. But you know what I'm talking about, because when you've got kids, there's constant demands on you. When you're at work at your secular jobs, you know there's constant demands on you. Jesus just needed time to rest and recuperate. So he got into the boat with his disciples and he directed them to go over to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. Now that's very important. He said, let us go over to the other side. And he promptly went into the boat and fell down asleep. It says he slept on a little pillow. Suddenly a mighty storm, the perfect storm, arose on the sea. The boat was small. The storm was huge. The rain came from above and the waves came from below, and the darkness increased and the light decreased. The disciples needed rescue and Jesus needed rest. Do you ever feel like that? The storm is huge. The rains are coming down and the waves are billowing up and there's darkness instead of light. I can't see anything ahead of me. It seems hopeless. I feel helpless in the midst of this. And there's Jesus at rest. The greatest storm that day wasn't in the winds or the waves, but it was in the hearts of the disciples, because their fears made them flounder. Their faith was challenged by their circumstances. They questioned, and then they accused Jesus of having a lack of concern, a lack of care. Those are some of the saddest words, I think, in the New Testament. Jesus, don't you care? Have you ever asked him those things? I think of the prophet Habakkuk. In the first chapter, he says, Lord, don't you care about Israel and all that it's going through? And then he says, don't you care? Are you fair? Are you even there? Do you feel sometimes in the midst of your circumstances that Jesus is just asleep somewhere? He's not hearing you. Nothing's happened. You don't see any hope. You don't see any light. You don't see any response. Jesus never responded to their accusation. However, he simply spoke the word, and chaos turned to calm and panic to peace. The words he spoke when he spoke to the winds and the waves were, peace, be still. Those words indicate that he was telling the winds to be gagged, like you would put something across the mouth. And then as he spoke to the waves, it was like a muzzle. He was saying, be gagged, be muzzled. What he was saying, he was rebuking them. And it indicates that this storm that arose was actually a weapon from Satan. And it was caused with the purpose to destroy Jesus. But Jesus turned evil into good as the disciples saw his power and his protection. Jesus simply spoke the word, and it was done. Fear of the sea was then eclipsed by fear of divinity as they saw Jesus calming the natural elements, because they turned and said, who is this that can do such a thing? I'm paraphrasing, of course. But the scripture says that they were terrified then. They were terrified of the winds and the waves, but they were even more terrified when they realized that this man, who was all human and all God, was there with them. Now, let me say this. Storms and crises come to all of us. It's part of the condition of man because of the fall in the garden. Storms come in unexpected ways, and they come at unexpected times. It's the call in the middle of the night. It's a doctor's report. It's going into your teenager's room and checking through his drawers and finding something like drug paraphernalia. It's that daughter coming home and telling you that she's pregnant. It's the husband announcing that he doesn't love you anymore and wants to leave. It's getting a final notice at work. It's finding out your medical insurance has gone up 3 times. And in a moment, everything changes. Our faith is challenged by the circumstances of our crisis, and we are faced with the big question. Don't you care? Don't you care? The enemy loves to make us ask that question. Don't you care? Max Lucado said, stress attacks our nerves. Storms attack our faith. Stress interrupts, but storms destroy. Stress comes like a siren. Storms come like a missile. Stress clouds the day. Storms usher in the night. The question of stress is, how can I cope? The question of storm is, where is God and why would he allow this into my life? I can remember many times asking those questions. When my two children were prodigals, one was living promiscuously and one was doing drugs. And I thought it looked hopeless and helpless. And many times I would go in the back of my house where I could be alone. And I would get down on my knees on the cement sidewalk and I would cry out to the Lord with the top of my voice. I was just like Jairus, just like the woman with the issue of blood, just like these disciples. And I would cry out, God, where are you? Don't you care that my children are perishing? Don't you care? The time when my husband went to the hospital with chest pains and we found out that he needed stents in his arteries that were blocked, and I realized for the first time I could lose this husband so quickly and so easily. It never had really dawned on me that I could lose him. Only to have him go in again 3 months later and have more stents put in, and then 3 months later have more stents put in. That guy's got 9 stents. He's an amazing man. But those times when I said, God, where are you in the midst of this storm? Why are you allowing me to go through this? Let me say that God allows storms for correction in our life because we've been disobedient. And sometimes we bring the storms on ourselves. Unfortunately, some of the storms that we're going through are the consequences of our lives before we knew the Lord. The one who's been promiscuous contracts a venereal disease that has no cure. She accepts the Lord. She still has this problem. I have friends who've gone through that. So sometimes the storms in our life are to correct us, to get us right back on the path. But most of the times I think and feel that our storms are for instruction. Correction and instruction. Sometimes, as I said, we create our own, but even in them we have the opportunity and the privilege of seeing God arise when things get too difficult. He allows us to get frightened enough to need him, and he uses the storms to reveal himself as never before. The disciples would never had the revelation of Jesus like they had in that boat if they hadn't been in the middle of the storm. Jesus knew when he said, let us go over to the other side. He knew that a storm was coming. He was God. He was omniscient. He knew all things. He could have said to his disciples, wait, we can't go now because a storm's going to arise on the sea. But he knew that in the midst of it, he was going to teach them some things that were very important that they could not experience any other way. And he allows the storms. What Satan means for evil, God means for good. And Satan will allow the storms to come in, but God has a purpose in the midst of it. And he could take us out like that. But he lets us go through the storms. And when I think back on the storms that I have experienced in my life, they have taught me valuable lessons that I could not know any other way. He uses the storms to reveal himself as never before. The disciples had a deeper revelation of Jesus Christ. Max Lucado said this, when you recognize God as creator, you will admire him. When you recognize his wisdom, you will learn from him. When you discover his strength, you'll rely on him, but only when he saves you will you worship him. When storms arise and we're going down, we're left with only one option, God. And what an option. And when we cry out, he'll arise. A storm is a small price to pay for a clear view of God. Let me repeat that last sentence. A storm is a small price to pay for a clear view of God.